Hello and welcome to another episode of the Empower Woman Show. My name is Reverend Amanda Betra, and on the show with me today is
𝐔𝐘𝐒.
And back by popular demand, we have another guest on the show today, who I hope is going to be a resident guest on the show. Actually, I'm going to adopt him, the only man that we've had on the show, and it was such a pleasure the last time you were on the show. So far, but it was such a pleasure the last time you were on the show. So we've got Nigel Langford, Director of Bible Society, with us on the show again today. And today on this show, we are going to be talking all about Esther. Phenomenal woman in the Bible. She is one of the only two women in the Bible that have books named after them. And so we're talking about the book of Esther in its entirety. There are some key things that we are going to touch on in this book. Like I said before, she's one of the only two women that have books named after her. This book as well is unique in the fact that it's one of the only two books in the Bible that does not talk about God directly. I mean, you can see the hand of God throughout the whole of the book of Esther, but there's no direct reference to God. The other book in the Bible is the Song of Solomon. And then, again, this book is written at a time when the Jewish were in exile. So it's completely set outside of the Promised Land. So it's interesting for us to see modern day have an experience of what it was like for the Jewish people outside of the Promised Land when they're in exile. There's a lot that we're going to talk about in the book of Esther today. But just as a start, when you think about the whole book of Esther, 𝐔𝐘𝐒, what is that for you? What does the book signify for you before we get into some minute detail?
Oh, that's a difficult question. There's a few themes. One is just about Esther's courage, which I think is down to how she was raised. So there's that theme of Esther's courage and how she was raised, and the role that Mordecai played in raising her as such a phenomenal woman. But then just all of the drama that ensued and how God, with his great sense of humor, turned things around for his people. Those are kind of the things that play around that. I mean, there's a lot more under that, but those things stand out for me.
So we'll dig deeper because the whole episode is committed to this book. But Nigel, just as a first quick summary of the book of Esther, what is the thing that stands out for you the most?
So I think there's three things in the book that come out at me, actually. It's courage, it's favor, and it's tension. Yeah. The book does not shy away from some really difficult things. And in the middle of that whole story is a very courageous woman who has the favor of God on her. But there's so many times I flick through the book and take a deep breath. And I don't think the Bible wants us to just move on to the next chapter. It wants us to really wrestle with what we're reading.
Yeah, I like that. There's that tension in the book. So should we start, let's maybe focus a bit on some of the characters. Let's start with Vashti.
Or Vashti.
Or Vashti, Queen Vashti, Queen Vashti. So we know that Xerxes is having a 180-day-long celebration, and then after that he goes into 7 days of drinking and feasting, and the Bible tells us it's in the 3rd year of his reign. I found that fascinating, that kind of detail, where it says it's in the 3rd year of his reign that this happens, but then later on in chapter 2 it tells us it's in the 7th year of his reign that Esther is brought before him. So that means she's got a period of 4 years of waiting before she even has the opportunity to meet with the king. But, you know, that's an aside. Let's start with Queen Vashti. She's summoned before a very drunk king at this time because he's been drinking for days, and asked to come and display her beauty wearing her crown. Now, the Bible isn't explicit if she was to come in just the crown, which, you know, we would understand why she said no, or if it's, you know, come dressed, but also come in your crown. What are the thoughts around her refusal to come before the king?
So let's remember that the king was having his thing with all of the men. She was having her thing with all of the women. So imagine the conversation going on there, right? You put a bunch of women together while the men are drinking and, you know. And I just wonder if perhaps there was a bit of, gosh, those guys are just you know, becoming something else. And in the middle of all of that, she gets this command to come and display yourself in front of these men that the women probably were wondering what they were up to. And I think I probably would have done the same, because you're thinking, I'm not quite sure the state that these people are in. I'm not sure I want to involve myself in that. But then also, just whether perhaps there was something about the congregation of women there, and some of them would have been like her companions, and a bit of advice, oh, this might not be the best idea. So I don't know. I just think that she probably didn't think it was the right thing to do, because it had been a long time of celebration, and only God knows. I mean, the kings in the Bible, they were very erratic in their behavior. So I would have done the same.
Okay. Nigel, what do you think?
Well, I think, you know, I know kings had more than one wife. I think we need to make that an understanding as well. In that, I think it's personally shocking that a husband would want to display their wife like that in front of everyone, but it was obviously a lot of trophy talk. I think the reason Vashti's highlighted isn't insignificant. He probably had lots of queens, but she obviously pushed the boundary. But I think it sets the scene for what's to come. And I think the reason why the whole Vashti situation is highlighted is now this is something that Esther is going to be in the context of and walk into. So in some ways, Vashti's actions have made it even harder for whoever's going to be following as the senior queen. So I think Vashti, she's incredibly brave to do that, and I think practically there's probably a lot of the things that have been said makes real sense. But for the writer who's trying to get a message across to the people reading it, it's actually a very indirect pointing toward, if you think it's bad for Vashti, because of Vashti's bravery, now whoever is coming in as queen is going to have it 3 times as hard because of all the edicts that follow that behavior.
No, that's a valid point, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's something about, let's not forget the consequence of her disobedience. And the king's advisors are right in saying that because of her disobedience, because of her refusal to come before the king, it might set a precedent for other women to think that it's okay for them to be disobedient to their husbands. So his request might have been out of character or out of the norm or out of whatever a woman would want to do, but the consequence of that disobedience was far-reaching. And I just wonder how, you use the word bravery and courage, but this is a time when, of course, women didn't have a voice, they didn't have a choice. This is the one time that is recorded in the Bible that there is direct disobedience to a king.
Was it bravery or was it foolishness?
That's the thing. So I don't know whether she was being brave or if she was being foolish.
She might have been under the influence as well, because they were having their own banquet for that same period of time. So I wonder if it was bravery or if it was she was propped up by some other something else.
I often think there's a real fine line between bravery and foolishness, isn't there?
Well, this is true.
I mean, you know, there's been times in my life where I thought I've acted very brave and been foolish, and I suppose it's down to the reader to make their mind up on where they land. I think whatever the situation, because she knew the outcome potentially of refusing the king, you could call it foolish, you could call it brave. I see it as bravery only because I believe there's a context that's being built that Esther comes into, where we often look at sort of like non-Jewish people in the Old Testament and think, oh, they're the pagans, and you know the heroes are here. But actually, there's a lot of time where there are sort of Gentile women who it doesn't go into great detail about, but the fact they did something that really stirred the nest is a big deal. And whether she was foolish or brave, she really stirred the nest, but created the context that Esther was going to have to walk into.
Yeah. So let's talk about that context that Esther's walking into now. So Esther is a young Jewish girl who is orphaned and has been adopted by her uncle. Throughout the chapters of the book of Esther, we see that she's got respect for the words of Mordecai. from entering into the palace and keeping her identity secret, to even after she's been made queen, she still has the ear of her uncle. She's still listening to him. She's still obeying his instructions. And so she's brought into this, harem, into the palace to be one of God knows how many women.
How many?
If it had taken her 4 years to get to her turn, I don't know whether the king was having a woman each night or whether it was a woman a month. The Bible is not clear. But there were a lot of women that would have had to go through that process of their one night with the king. And, you know, the Bible tells us that they have one night with him, and then after that they're moved into a harem where the king's concubines are kept, and they only come back to the king except he remembers them and calls them by name. Some people describe the book of Esther as a love story, or, you know, this wonderful woman, lucky woman that got married to a king. But actually, when we strip it back a bit, this is a pagan king for a Jewish girl. This is a girl that is being thrown into one of 100 or one of 200. It wasn't necessarily the love story. I mean, it ended up being some kind of romantic story. The Bible tells us that he loved her more than anybody else, and we see that, you know, the king he's willing to listen to her, and he says, ask me anything, even up to half my kingdom I will give to you. So there must have been some kind of affection, but it's not the, as a young girl I pray I want to be Queen Esther kind of story, is it?
No, but I want to just go back to something that you said, because it struck me. The fact that she was raised by Mordecai and she was attentive to his words, she listened to him. You know, I said initially that the way she was raised, I think, played a big part in it, because when she went into the harem, she listened to the eunuchs there. And when it was her turn to go before the king, she took only what they asked her to do. So there was something about that respect and relationship she had for Mordecai that she took with her into her life and respected the eunuchs as well, and that's helped her to sort of win the favor of the king, because she knew nothing about him, right? But these are people who would have known the king and who would have known what he liked and all of that. And just the fact that she paid attention to them, she was humble enough to listen to them and to go to them for guidance, it gave her, you know, an edge, I think.
So the tension in the book of Esther, and I'm going to go there. The tension in the book of Esther starts with Mordecai's disobedience to the edict of the king, which says, when you see Haman, bow down to him. Now, all the other Jews did. He chose not to. So the whole tension in this book, where there is a reason for the Jews to be potentially annihilated, is because Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman.
Or he dared.
Or he dared not to bow.
He dared to
So
bow
you
to
put
no
a
other
whole-
god.
You put a whole nation at risk because of your own disobedience.
But he didn't see it that way. Mordecai didn't say, you know what, everything be damned, my nation be damned, I'm not going to bow down to Haman. I don't think that's how it was. I see it kind of in the same way that Daniel refused to bow, you know, in the book of Daniel, and that got him into the lion's den as well. It's the same sort of thing. My interpretation of that is that he just decided, I bow down to God. I know who I serve. Who is Haman?
Well, okay.
I also
Nigel, what do you
think, actually, in the time we're talking about, a lot of Israelites had gone back. So Ezra and Nehemiah had gone back to build the wall. And there were a small group of diaspora Jews in Susa, where, you know, southwest Iran, where sort of the capital of Persia was. And actually they were allowed to, over a period of time, were allowed to observe their own rites and traditions, which actually did often mean pushing it quite far with the king. So it sounds like Mordecai was, you know, just sort of giving one to the establishment, as it were. But actually, it wasn't so much that. It was that he was within his right to say, we have special rights that were observed by previous kings. You remember when Nehemiah goes into the king, doesn't he? And he's shaken and he's like, I've got a heart for my old land, and the wall, I've heard the wall is been smashed. And the king grants him, he sees his heart and he sends him, right? And at the same time, Israel go through a period of, they actually have some rights that are given to them. So it's more about the people on the other side looking at Mordecai and having a deep hatred for him and who he represents than just that individual action all on its own.
Yeah, but it was a catalyst, though.
It was a catalyst, but there was a whole lot of other... It wasn't just like somebody walked up to Mordecai and thought, ding, oh, I suddenly really don't like... It was much deeper than that. And there was a lot of resentment towards the Jewish diaspora, mainly because people were thinking, well, how dare you not bow to... How dare you have your own rights? But it was something that they were able to function in at that time.
Okay. So, digging a bit deeper into the story, now Mordecai has refused to bow down to Haman. Haman starts to do this plot where he goes to the king and he says, I will give you 10,000 pieces of silver. There are people, there are some Jews that we need to get rid of. They don't respect you. They don't, follow your ways. Let's get rid of them. The king agrees. So now all of their lives are at risk. Mordecai hears...
Because one man hated one man and decided to wipe out a whole...
Yes. I mean, he could have just wiped out the one man, but he was like, no, that's not going to be sufficient.
There's another, he brings to mind another person who did that, again, starting with the letter H, but I'll not be controversial enough to say that name.
I think it was a deep hatred because people didn't like the fact the Jews were able to do that, were able to celebrate some of their festivals.
But apart from that, Haman's hatred, though, comes from he was an Agagite. And it comes from the fact that generations before there had been a wiping out. So this is him wanting to rewrite history as such.
Of course,
and do the same.
And do the same thing.
I was saying that we see stories in the Bible where people were wiped out. So it was not he didn't just come up with that idea by himself. He had seen it done and so the thought occurred to him, but it doesn't make it right.
So then we see, let's look at examples of where we see the hand of God. Xerxes can't sleep. He calls for the book of remembrance and he sees that Mordecai has done something that he was never rewarded for. And so I love that bit where he calls Haman and says, what should we do to a man that has pleased the king? And
hang on, don't gloss over the timing.
The timing, okay.
I talked about God being like a puppet master in the background. Xerxes, whatever his name is, the king can't sleep. He asks them to read, and they just happen to read this bit. And Haman just happens to be in the court, having come up with this plot, and he's there at the right time. Like, you can't make it up. It's like fiction. Well,
and I think you're right, and that's why it's really not an issue that God's not mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, people have real hang-ups about the fact that God's not mentioned in the book of Esther. If you have to name it, you really do have to think, who's reading this book? Because you read it and it's so obvious that God's hidden us again. It's not his absence. He's at work in all these different bits. And the timing, every bit of timing, and I think, you think about our own lives, and when things are looking really bleak, you see the hand of God and times in our lives where things are moving and we think, oh, what a coincidence. There's no such thing. God is at work.
God is working.
Yeah, and he is in this book, exactly as you say.
But going back to the point I think you were trying to get to, it's hilarious, right? When the king's asking him, what shall I do to someone who pleases the king? And of course, narcissistic Haman, who wants the whole world to bow down to him, thinks, oh, actually, you know what? That's not enough. The king loves me even more. I'll get some more. And then he starts to list all of these things that he thinks he's going to get. And
let's talk about another woman in this story. So we've touched on Vashti, we've touched on Esther, but there's Haman's wife, Zeresh. Now that woman is interesting because she's the one who tells Haman to prepare a gory way for Mordecai to be murdered. Like, what kind of wife gives her husband that type of advice? And you were going to say something about Zeresh, because I remember we were talking about her.
Yeah, well, Zeresh actually means, her name means misery. And you only have to read the story to realise that there's something really deeply tragic going on in her life, that she has that much angst that she wants to see that happen. And it brought me back to the text about, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. And in this case, it really doesn't seem to be the case, because actually, it matters who's whispering to you. And that's the kind of application for us, right? It matters who we listen to. because the outcome in our lives can change by who we actually pay attention to. And Zeresh becomes this poisonous voice into the ear of her husband and actually contaminates him even more. And so he might have been really contaminated already, but no one around him was doing anything to call him out on it. So who we listen to, you can have a lot of venom in you already, but if you've got someone else inside your ear speaking, then that can become massive. It can become even bigger.
I wanted to say just that point. It was something that stood out for me reading Esther, because a lot of times you hear if it pleases the king, if it pleases the king. It just sounded throughout that there were people whispering into his ears and whispering into Esther's, whispering into all sorts of ears. And for some reason, it jumped out at me about the voices and the people that you have around you and the kind of influence that they have on the decisions that you make. So interesting that it's that point with Sarah.
I'm just sitting here thinking, in season 1, we did an episode that we did not call wicked women.
I was going to say she should have been
in that episode.
She should have been in that episode.
She should have been in that episode. If you haven't seen that episode, please do. We titled it Female Villains in the Bible, but I'm thinking we missed out Zeresh, because it's so interesting that you have a woman that, like you say, becomes that voice of wickedness in her husband's ears.
And also to say, I mean, you know, she didn't limit, I mean, however bad Haman is, it's like she's the one planting the seed about wipe them all out.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, don't settle for one, get rid of them all. And, you know, you think to myself, my gosh, I mean, that is like genocide.
Yeah.
You see the contrast.
A woman is responsible for is used as a catalyst for the saving of the Jews. But on the other hand, there's another woman that is responsible for the annihilation.
That's exactly what I was going to say, that the contrast between her and what Esther did with the king for the Jews. Just like choose the kind of woman you let into your life, people, because it has a great impact.
Let's talk about what Esther did. So we know that as the story goes, and please, we do encourage you to take some time to read the book of Esther for yourself so that you can put a lot of what we're saying in context. But as the story goes, Mordecai sends words to Esther, go and speak to the king, plead on behalf of us Jews. Initially, she's reluctant. Then we see that beautiful part of the scripture where he says, don't think that because you're there, you're going to be saved.
Yes.
Who knows whether you're called for such a time as this? And that's a scripture that has been read so many times, has been said so many times, and actually, it's true. There are situations we find find ourselves in where God has divinely placed us for a particular time. But what I love about Esther's story is the way that she approaches the king. And it's one of the lessons for me when I think about the book of Esther. How do you speak to somebody in authority? How do you go and ask for something in the way that you receive it? Because what Esther did is, first of all, you fast and pray. So you take it to God in prayer and you bring God into it. Then the second thing is, you don't just approach royalty and say, oh, and by the way, here's my problem, solve it. She gave before she received. She set up a banquet. She invited him to come and have a meal. She opened up herself with the gift of hospitality. There was that gentle honor and that gentle introduction first. And not just once, she did it twice. And it was only after she had brought the king to the place where his heart was rested, he felt like he has received, he has gotten a lot out of this woman, that she was willing to say, well, actually, here's my problem. So that's one of the key lessons I think that we can learn from that book, how to interact with nobility.
Can I build on that? I actually feel that there's a little bit of detail, so I'm making it a bit more practical here, but when it talks about that Esther was adopted and that she lost her parents, there's something, and I'm an adoptive father, so I can talk with a little bit of authority on this, that when you go through trauma as a child and you lose something, there is often an inherent building up in you of how to survive or how to cope. And I know that we've read a lot about God's favor and courage and all that, but there's something about that detail. You are told about that, I think, not just because to hear the family history of Esther, but I think there's something in there that God uses, like a resilience or a sense of seeing difficulty all around and learning to sort of, how do I survive in this environment? let's not underplay the practicality in Esther's life as somebody who had such loss young of age, growing up with that trauma, and then being in a situation where she's facing down serious situations again. Imagine, I can't imagine what it would be like to go and put your body on the line for someone you've never met before, with so much power, who's then got a nation on her back, who's it feels all on her. There's this sense of, how do I manage and cope with all this drama? And in the text, the Hebrew writer, and you could miss it in a heartbeat, says, and she was adopted by Mordecai. She lost her mother and father at a young age. And that's meant to say that even with that pain and difficulty, God uses that to instruct her in wisdom when she's in really difficult situations when she's older.
That's so beautiful. So that's beauty out of ashes.
Yes.
That absolutely is beauty out of ashes. And we have come to the end of another beautiful episode. I really enjoyed talking to you guys. So final words from you. What is the God factor in this book of Esther, and what do you want our audience to take away from her story?
God is always at work. He is always at work. Like a little puppet master, he is always at work. And, you know, again, you talked about Esther being instructed in the place of pain and suffering. God honestly uses every little bit of our lives to make something beautiful. So just trust him.
Trust him. Thank you. Nigel, last words from you?
Yeah, so the name of Esther, it sums up the whole book, right? There's a Persian name for her, which is Star, and there's a Hebrew name for her, which is Hidden. And what I really love is that there's a hiddenness and then there's a stardom all at the same time, and it's God who decides when the hiddenness happens and when the stardom comes. And I'd say to anyone listening, don't try and push things in your life. Allow God to be the person who at times will hide you away and at times will reveal something to you. And I just love that name, because my mum's called Esther. I've got quite a deep love for the story, so that's what comes out of me.
Thank you so much. It really has been a pleasure. This is one of my favorite books in the Bible for so many reasons. It's been great that we could draw out some real examples and see the practicality of God's hand in the life of his people. But like you said, God will use, you said in one of the episodes when we talked about Ruth, that God will use the most unlikely people. I mean, who would have thought a young Jewish adopted orphan is the one that was responsible for the salvation of the Jews. And that's just God all over again. Thank you. We've come to the end of another episode. Please do get in touch with us. We want to hear your thoughts. We encourage you to write to us, give us some feedback. Let us know if there are any women that you want us to talk about in a bit more detail as well. And we look forward to serving you in another episode. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.